Well, it's great to have with us today on Crimson Chronicles Keith Dunnavant. Keith is an acclaimed author, documentary filmmaker, and media trailblazer who specializes in contemporary American history. He's been a sports writer, newsroom executive, and magazine owner before authoring several important football books, including biographies of Coach Paul Bear Bryant, Joe Montana, and Bart Starr. Keith also authored The Missing Ring, the incredible story of Alabama's 1966 uncrowned football team, the only undefeated, untied squad in the nation, only to be robbed of a national championship. A native of Athens, Alabama, where his father and brother were involved in the media business, Keith's ties to Alabama and the Crimson Tide go way back to 1983 when he began working in the Alabama Sports Information Office for SID Wayne Atchison, our good friend. Keith and I share one common element. Other than our love for the Crimson Tide, we were both sports editors of the Crimson White, me in 1977-78, and Keith just a few years later in 1986 and 87. Keith co-directed the 2023 ESPN Films documentary Bart Starr for the SEC Story series. He also directed the syndicated independent film 3 Days at Foster, which focused on the long overlooked athletic pioneers who shattered the color barrier at the University of Alabama. His latest project is the outstanding documentary Wishbone, on which he served as executive producer. Wishbone, which is one of the SEC Story documentaries, explores the paths taken by Oklahoma, Texas, and Alabama as they transitioned to the iconic Wishbone offense in the late 60s and early 70s. Rick, we could fill up an entire podcast just talking about all that Keith has accomplished. But Keith, welcome to Crimson Chronicles, and we'll touch on a few of those today.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be with you, and boy, I must be really old.
I know how old you are.
Keith, actually, I mean, we covered that before we started recording. You just started really early.
I did,
right? So that's really the key.
I did. I was very, very fortunate. I grew up in a media family, so I grew up following my dad around. My dad was a radio pioneer in North Alabama, and one of my brothers was a great print journalist, later with Birmingham News and others. And but I started doing things when I was in elementary school, but I literally started my media career when I was between the 8th and 9th grade, really, and invented a job. I couldn't get a job. Nobody would give me a job because I had no experience. It's the old conundrum. So I figured out a way to invent a job as sports editor of a little weekly paper in Athens, Alabama, and somehow I ended up covering Alabama and Auburn in the SEC when I was a freshman in high school.
Wow. Think what you could have done in the age of blogs. I mean, as an 8th grader, you could have revolutionized.
Well, here's the thing.
That's
I've thought about that a lot through the years, and I've talked to a lot of young people. One of the things that I had going for me is that in those days is that, first of all, I didn't look 12. Okay, I didn't look 35, but I didn't look younger than I was, and so. And plus, there was no internet, so the people that I was writing letters to get credentialed or calling on the phone, I sounded professional. I knew how to write a letter. I knew how to work the system. So if they had been able to Google me and see that I didn't have a driver's license, I might not have been able to pull this off, because there was a little bit of I was legitimate, but. Tommy, you remember at one point back in those days, there were actually some of my early press passes that it said, no one under 16 admitted. So for a couple of years there, I guess you could say I was illegal.
Well, despite that, Keith, you've really become one of the definitive voices in the history of Alabama football, and I talk a little bit about what originally drew you to chronicling those deeper narratives about the Crimson Tide.
Well, that's a really good question. I started obviously as a sports writer, and I got to Alabama on scholarship, basically because of Coach Bryant, and I got to work my way through school that way, and it was just such an honor, and I was just so fortunate. But my goal coming out of high school, coming out of college, was to cover national college football. I'd already covered Alabama and Auburn, the SEC, and I wanted to challenge myself, and so my goal was to find a way to. And there were only a few of those jobs, a few national college football writing jobs in the country, and fortunately, I was able to go to Los Angeles and have an entry-level job at the LA Times, which got me to New York to a magazine called Sports Inc. And then when I was 25 years old, something called the National Sports Daily was started. It was the first national sports all sports newspaper, started by one of my boyhood heroes, Frank DeFord. And I got hired as one of the young guns there, the youngest writer on the staff. And within time, I was able to cover national college football, which was my goal. And I thought, okay, honestly, I thought it would take me into my early 30s to do that. And I got to do it when I was 25. So what I'm saying is that I was able to, all of these things, starting young, it kind of, one thing led to another. And I loved that. I loved that job. And when that ended, I wanted to get the magazine business. That was, and I wanted, and this is the long way around to answer your question here, but I wanted to get in the magazine business to start magazines. I wanted to be a magazine feature writer. You're talking about deeper narratives. So I was writing about, political figures and sports figures and cultural stuff, and people like Jan Winter and Ted Turner and all these guys. But so the magazine feature writing led inevitably into writing those deeper sports narratives. And of course, I really never intended to write a book on Coach Bryant, to be honest with you. It just worked out. And so my book, The Missing Ring, came about for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that one of the books that I was writing at the time when I was running a magazine in New York was stolen. All of the materials were stolen by my apartment complex. And so I had to start over on something else, or I might not have written The Missing Ring at that point. So all of these things, you never can tell when one thing is going to lead to the next. You never can tell when life takes you this way, how it can really change things for you.
Well, Keith, we mentioned the biography you did on Coach Bryant and Bart Starr, but where do you start? What's your starting point on something? How do you find the human being behind the legend? You can't just write about Coach Bryant's on the field results or Bart Starr's championship years with the Packers. You got to go behind the curtain.
That's true.
How do you find the human being part?
Very true. I think it's just like any other kind of reporting. You have to do the detail work. You have to. People often are surprised when I tell them that when I go out and report a subject for a book, I use maybe 5% of what I learned. Maybe 5%.
Wow.
It's choosing the right 5%, and you have to. But as far as the story itself, the story of Coach Bryant. Obviously, I grew up a huge fan of Coach Bryant's. I covered his last teams. I got to Alabama on scholarship because of him, and that changed my life. But when I decided to write that book, I had to check that at the door. Now, I'm not going to tell you that I was not influenced, that my narrative was not influenced by the fact that I had grown up a huge fan of Coach Bryant. Of course it was. It'd be dishonest to tell you otherwise. But I had to deal with, all of the things that made him successful, but also controversial. You had to write about Junction. You had to write about, Coach Bryant had a drinking problem. And I deal with that honestly in that book. But at the same time, hopefully what the portrait that comes through is someone who absolutely represented the best of the American dream. And what Coach Bryant did for people, myself included, we could spend all this entire time, talking about
Yeah.
Coach Bryant's influence on Alabama and just individuals.
What an incredible conversation we're having with Keith Dunnavant. Thanks for joining us. We're glad you're here, and we want to just encourage you to like, to comment, to subscribe to the podcast. We're thankful that you're along for the journey with us as we continue to help keep alive the stories of Alabama sports here with Crimson Chronicles. And so thanks for being here, and we appreciate you hitting that button and giving us a little bit of feedback. We love hearing about who you want to hear on the podcast, who you want us to talk with. And this interview today is a result of some folks that reached out and said, hey, we'd love to hear from Keith and hear some deeper stories. And so Keith, thanks for being with us. But folks, thanks for pointing this out and saying we'd love to see you guys have this conversation. So Tommy?
Yeah, Keith, staying on the Coach Bryant biography, which, by the way, for our listeners and viewers, is called Coach: The Life of Paul Bear Bryant, an outstanding book. I think in 1996, right, Keith?
96, Simon & Schuster.
That came out. In that book, in doing your book, what surprised you the most that the public still does not appreciate about Coach Bryant?
I would say the thing that comes to mind is that even growing up in Alabama during that time, I think the public, unless you were around at the time in the 60s and 70s, if you're a big Alabama fan today, you know Coach Bryant just as a legend. A guy in a record book, a guy in a houndstooth hat, a guy who, is this icon. The human being is that Coach Bryant represented. Coach Bryant had all these insecurities when he was a young boy, riding to Fordyce on that wagon, having to sell vegetables with his mama on Saturdays, and being made fun of by the more prosperous city boys of Fordyce. That marked him deeply, deeply. And here you think about when I was a young sports writer, and as a young kid, I think a lot of people tended to hear Coach Bryant in his poor mouthing and, oh, that's just an act and all this stuff. Coach Bryant never got over those hateful voices. And he never wanted to have to go behind a plow. That we thought that was, kind of, hokey and all that stuff. But I'm telling you, after spending time with his story, knowing hundreds of his players and members of his family and people who worked for him, Coach Bryant was profoundly affected by the hateful voices of his youth, because they had the power to make him feel small. And so he never, when he became the most dominant man in his profession, beloved in our home state, helped us feel better about ourselves. He never forgot how it felt to feel small. And I hope that people reading that book would understand.
Keith, I think with Coach Bryant's leadership, he changed as a leader over time. And could you talk a little bit about what you saw as the biggest leadership shifts from him in the 50s versus Coach Bryant in maybe the 70s and 80s?
Yeah, I think like any other leader, I think he learned from his mistakes. He often talked about a great running back that he ran off during the Junction period, who was named Kenneth Hall, who even today just recently died within the last year. Great running back from Texas, and set all sorts of records. And Coach Bryant had this belief that if you had great ability, he was going to push you even harder. Okay, he believed that even the great talents needed to be pushed, and sometimes he played that so well that he ran people off that, in hindsight, many years later, he would have handled differently. And he always talked in later years about how he mishandled Kenneth Hall. He always regretted. So later in life, I think it's not that he was any less. He still kept pushing people hard. You got to listen. You talk to those guys in the late '70s and early '80s. He pushed the devil out of them to make them great. But he learned how to be a little bit smarter. He learned to. It was about nuance, I think. But I think he became a coach later on. First of all, you know, the 1966 team that I wrote about, the Missing Ring team, those guys from the early and mid 60s, they were able to recruit in 1962 65 players, 65, no scholarship limitations. So he could run as many of them off as he wanted to, and he ran most of them off. I think they had 17 seniors in '66. So because of that, he could be a different coach in the early mid '60s than he could be in the late '70s when you had the 30-95 rule. So I think the way he changed basically is that he learned to adapt to the times, to the rules, and to the young men that, you know, of course, the mamas and papas were sending him different kind of kids, you know, by the late '70s as well. You know, the kids were not quite as dutiful. They'd come through the protesting '60s and all that stuff. So some of them were challenging authority. So in so many ways, Coach Bryant is a mirror of that time and place.
Keith, you mentioned the '60s, and that was a time of change for not only the South but for the nation as well, with civil rights issues and the Vietnam War and the drug culture and Woodstock and the hippies, and it was quite a change for Coach Bryant. But how did his understanding of the South's identity crisis shape the way he built the program? And we're talking mainly about the integration of the University of Alabama and how all that played into his thinking.
Well, I think first of all, the Missing Ring season, which I used to basically as a, you know, that I often tell people that that's a culture book disguised as a football book. Because my idea with that book was always to write about the world that had shaped me, and to use that Alabama football team to do that. And Coach Bryant, first of all, he was our antidote to all the negativity, all the slings and arrows that the scorn of the national media, who were, you know, emphasizing all the bad things that were happening, like, you know, Selma and the Birmingham riots and so forth, all the things that we should have been ashamed of, but that didn't define 95% of the state of Alabama, which was peaceful and was getting along. He was our antidote to all that stuff, to George Wallace and Bull Connor. But at the same time, of course, that the team was all white because, you know, he was stuck in the segregated system just like all these other instruments of Southern culture. So negotiating that was a challenge for him. You know, on the one hand, he's a football coach. He's not the president of the university. You say, well, you know, how powerful he was. Well, yeah, he was powerful. He was beloved, and he was powerful, and he had all sorts of influence. But he couldn't snap his fingers and make segregation go away. So I think that the transition that he negotiated to lead the state to lead the program into integration, starting with the walk-ons in 1967, which we talk about in 3 Days of Foster. One of my personal heroes as a kid, Wilbur Jackson, guys like that in the early 70s. What he did in becoming an example said to the rest of us that this This is coming. It needs to happen. We need to get along. We need to love each other. And, guys like me were suddenly influenced by Coach Bryant, because I was out there in Athens, Alabama, playing football in the backyard, and with black friends, of course. But I was pretending to be Wilbur Jackson and Calvin Culliver, and Willie Shelby. And that was a profound thing. We didn't understand it at the time, but it was a profound thing. And so Alabama is lucky, profoundly lucky, that they had a man leading that evolution who was able to lead it in such a looking back at it now, a situation that was, the timing was, I think, just about right.
Keith, I had the honor of overseeing the induction of those 5 African-American football walk-ons to be inducted as honorary members of the A Club in 2014. And I think a lot of that had to do as a result of your documentary, 3 Days at Foster, and the role that James Sanderson played in getting those guys recognized. And one had passed away, one was not able to make it, but 3 of them were there that day. And I think they were very honored to be there, and we certainly took them in with open arms. So it was them as honorary members of the A Club.
And I think that was a wonderful moment. Wonderful moment.
Keith, I wanted to press in a little bit, because I think one of the really interesting things about all that is how Coach Bryant threaded the needle between being successful as a coach and coaching successful teams while being a part of social change during integration. And I think he did both, not one or the other. And I'd just love to hear your perspective on how he negotiated that, that sort of threading of the needle between those 2 very, very difficult situations.
Well, I think most people, because I was, only about 7 when Wilbur started playing, but most people in Alabama were really just not all that attuned to what was going on. They, the integration was very subtle at that point. And I've often, I have, there are people who never set foot in Alabama who have views on this that are not very nuanced. And I could, one of the segregation was an awful thing. Okay, the football coaches didn't create it; it's created by politicians. Sure. Football coaches coming along in the middle of this had to solve the problem, what people forget is that one of the main things that had to happen was that the integration had to really start at the high school level. And that started in the late 60s. For instance, in Huntsville, in The Missing Ring, I wrote about a guy named Rabbit Thomas, who was the first significant African-American player for mostly previously white high school at Butler High School in 1965. Well, that's 4+ years before Wilbur is recruited. And people, you might say, well, gosh, that took a long time. Well, yeah, it took a long time, but hearts and minds were being changed in the late 60s. Hearts and minds were being changed, one community at a time. So by the time it got to Alabama, and Wilbur is rooming, with our friend Rod Stakely on the road games, white guy from Huntsville. And they are fighting, this battle together. And Wilbur has all these new friends on this Alabama football team, and he just happens to be the only black guy for the first year. That's the way it was. They took him in. And same thing with Wendell Hudson. And Ray Odoms, who I just saw today is going to be put in the Alabama Sports Hall of Fame. That just warms my heart because Ray was as a little boy, he was one of my favorite Alabama basketball and, of course, football players as well. And but those guys, if you talk to them now, they understand that they were pioneers, but they also understand that they were being put in a situation that nobody knew what was going to happen. But Coach Bryant, more than anything else, he was responsible for all of those young men. All of them. Black, white, whatever. And he didn't want anybody to get hurt. He did not want to put some mother's son in a situation where he was going to be in danger. So that was that was one of the things that slowed it down. But people, you could argue that Coach Bryant should have done it earlier. Okay, there are people who actually think that he could have done it in 1963. Well, you were living on Mars if you thought that. So reasonable people can disagree about timing. I wish he had done it earlier, but I tell you what, I'm telling you, in my little world, Wilbur Jackson and John Mitchell and Willie Shelby and Sly Croom, they're heroes.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Keith, we could talk about Coach Bryant and your book all day long, but shifting to Bart Starr, who was obviously one of my heroes growing up, and I got to know Bart and Bart Jr. Well into the 80s and 90s, and actually went to a Packers game with him in '09 with my 12-year-old son, and it was quite an experience. But what aspects of Bart Starr's early life at Alabama most shaped him? He was there in the mid-'50s, the dreaded mid-'50s, where we were, as they say, the band wore black and we couldn't cross the 50-yard line. So,
that's really such a good question. I think more than anything, two things I would say. The first of all, obviously, is that without Johnny D, coach, of course, the great Rocket 8, one of the greatest, maybe the greatest. We'd have to argue about that Alabama basketball team of all time. Without Johnny D, we probably don't know who Bart Starr is. He probably would have been a career Air Force officer and settled into a good life. He just loved as he was, but we wouldn't know his name because he wasn't a star for the Packers. But I think in a larger sense, I think the disappointment, the heartache of, frankly, that you both being doubted by his father and being doubted and just misused by the Alabama coaching staff in the mid-'50s ended up being something that a muscle that Bart could lean on, because all those doubts made him work harder, made him push himself, and if he had not had that want to, and if a guy named Lombardi had not shown up, we don't know Bart's name.
Unpack that a little bit more about the journey from unheralded quarterback coming from Alabama to an NFL legend. What was that journey like for Bart Starr?
Well, of course, he was drafted in the 17th round. He was 199th player taken, I believe, in those days. Nobody thought he would make it. They didn't even give him a quarterback. I think they gave him 45. They didn't even give him a quarterback number. Um, his contract was $6,500, which he found out that he was only going to make that if he made the team, and nobody thought he'd make the team. So there's just all this swirling doubt, Bart. And he somehow makes it. He survives camp because he works his behind off, because that's the kind of guy Bart was, and he wanted it. He wanted a future in professional football. But when Lombardi comes along, he's the guy that, Bart, he was not Johnny U. He wasn't an artist like Johnny U. He wasn't a bomb thrower like Joe Namath. He wasn't a scrambler like Grant Tarkington. But he had something. He didn't beat himself, for one thing. He was tough as nails. I love the story about one of the great Chicago Bears when he was first starting. And of course, Bart was the nicest man you ever would meet in your life. I mean, I have interviewed somewhere over 20,000 people in my life. Bart is the finest gentleman I think I've ever known. And if by the way, and Tommy knows this, if you ever dared call him Mr. Starr, he would say, "My name's Bart."
That's right. Exactly.
But I love the story. People thought he was because of that, because he was such a gentleman, because he was such a nice guy. A lot of his teammates thought, "Oh, well, he's not tough enough." And I love the story of when they're playing the Bears and they have that first good team under Lombardi, and one of the great Chicago Bears just clobbers him. And he says something like, "Well, that'll do it for you, Starr," something like that. And Bart cusses him. And his teammates, including not Bill Curry, including Jerry Kramer. Jerry Kramer's like, "I didn't know Bart knew words like that. This guy's tougher than we thought." And so he goes up. Next thing you know, he throws a touchdown.
Wow.
So he did not beat himself. He was incredibly smart. A smart play caller and he was a lot tougher than anybody thought he was.
Keith, speaking of Jerry Kramer, in elementary school, I ordered his book, Instant Replay, from the, Scholastic Book Company or something, all the fifth
written
and
by the
sixth
great
graders.
Shapp. Dick Shapp wrote that with him.
That's right, Dick Shapp. And we ordered it fifth or sixth grade. And I remember, I probably still have it, knowing the pack rat that I am. But I did. You mentioned Lombardi, but how much in your book do you go into the partnership between Bart and Lombardi? Because Vince Lombardi is just a fascinating figure in sports history, and have our guy Bart Starr from Alabama playing for Lombardi and winning Super Bowls had to have been such a fantastic experience for both of them.
Yeah, the partnership is central, really central to the book. Lombardi, as I said, was a guy who he didn't think Bart was tough enough. He didn't think he was good enough, and Bart slowly won him over. Slowly, and by the end of their time together, winning that fifth championship in 7 years.
Yeah, well, you're listening to Crimson Chronicles podcast, and we do encourage you to join our Yay Alabama NIL partnership. Go to YEA-Alabama.com and see how you can help Yay Alabama help our athletes at the University of Alabama. And I encourage you to like this episode. Go to our Spotify, Apple, or YouTube and hit subscribe and hit like and let us know what you think about Crimson Chronicles.